Today we'll be building Uriel to absolutely destroy Steel Path using only 2 Forma. And whether you prefer nuking the entire map or simply using your weapons, I've got a build for you. So grab a coffee, sit back, and relax, because this is everything you need to know about the devil from hell. Uriel. And you'll be able to easily replicate what you just saw by the end of the video, as I'm going to walk you through everything you need to know about him, starting with his abilities, because Uriel's passive is one of the most powerful I've seen, and it has 2 parts to it: the gauge on the right, and his demonic companions that follow him. But as intimidating as it sounds, Uriel is actually a really easy frame to use, and we'll start off by going through the gauge. To put it simply, Uriel's 4th ability can only be cast when the gauge is full, so we will want to fill the gauge up in order to unleash our ultimate ability. And each of our demon companions provides us with a unique way to charge it. So let's jump right into what his companions actually do. Uriel has 3 companions from his passive: Catenach, Gulphagor, and Vythelas. But because I keep forgetting their names, I'm just going to name them as the bird, the snake, and the lich. And starting off with the bird. It's basically a flying companion that will attack enemies by latching onto them. And upon doing so, it will stagger the enemy and damage them over time. Enemies that the bird is attached to will also have a mark above their heads, and killing a marked enemy will fill our gauge by an amount. But that's not all, because upon killing a marked enemy, they will drop an energy orb along with 3 health orbs. And this ability scales with strength, meaning that the more ability strength we have, the more orbs that we will receive. Couple that with equilibrium, and we'd have an abundant supply of health and energy. And to top it all off, the marked enemy will also leave behind a damage area upon dying. This area will deal heat status and damage to enemies that are inside it. But relying on a tiny area to damage enemies is not ideal. So that's where our next companion comes in, giving us extra heat damage directly to our weapons. Introducing the Lich. Now, unlike his other companions, the Lich doesn't actually attack enemies, but he instead provides us with a slew of buffs using his orbs. Every 12 seconds, the Lich will convert a nearby corpse into a collectible orb, and we can easily find the orb as it's shown on the minimap. Upon picking up the orb, we will get extra heat damage and fire rate added to our weapon. Furthermore, both the increased fire rate and extra damage are affected by our ability strength. Ability duration, on the other hand, will affect how long this buff lasts. Something to note, however, is that only a maximum of 3 orbs can be active at any point in time. But now that we know how to buff our weapons, let's move on to how we can effortlessly destroy a group of enemies. Introducing the snake, the companion that will allow us to passively kill more enemies. So the snake will basically chain enemies together, and damage done to them will now also be shared by all other chained enemies. Additionally, enemies chained will also get damaged over time and slowed by the snake. Both the slow and damage is affected by our ability strength. Furthermore, killing a chained enemy will also help to fill up our gauge, and since damage is shared among them, killing one of the chained enemies usually results in the entire group dying, which is a decent way of charging our gauge. That being said, there is an even faster way to charge our gauge, and I'll be going through it later on in the video. But for now, we're going to talk about survivability, because what good are your demons if they're all dead? Well, that's where Uriel's 2nd ability comes in handy. And yes, I will be going through his 2nd ability before going over the rest of them since we're already on the topic of demons. Uriel's 2nd ability is Remedium, and casting it will heal our demons along with fully resurrecting those that died. This is a really important ability because our demons actually have a high amount of aggro, which means that enemies are more likely to shoot at them instead of us. Therefore, keeping our demons alive with it will help with our survivability. But that's not all, because our 2nd ability also directly helps with our survivability, because upon casting it, we will cleanse ourselves of status effects along with restoring our own health and shields. The best part is that any excess shields will automatically become overshields. But we're not done yet, because while casting this ability, Uriel literally becomes invulnerable, meaning that if you want to shield gate at higher levels, all you have to do is to tap this ability. But now that we know how his survivability works, let's move on to the ability that lets us fly through maps and bring hell to our enemies. Introducing Infernalis. This is Uriel's first ability, and casting it will provide us with an aura of flames that deals heat damage to all nearby enemies. Furthermore, the damage done has a 100% status chance, which means that this ability also procs heat status to nearby enemies. But hold on, because we're not here for that, aren't we? What we're actually here for is the incredible mobility that it provides us. Because while this ability is active, tapping the dodge key while airborne will turn us into a flying meteor and will constantly move forward. We can control the direction of travel by moving our camera, and aiming with our weapon will stop the meteor. This is one of my favorite abilities in the game, and unlike Wukong's Cloudwalker, Uriel's meteor feels incredibly seamless, almost like you're performing a bullet jump. Furthermore, we can remain flying for as long as our first ability is active, which makes this an amazing ability to travel through maps. However, colliding headfirst with a wall will prematurely end our flight. Lastly, casting our first ability will also give our demons the flame aura, damaging enemies that come into contact with them. That being said, we actually do not have to get close to enemies in order to burn them with our first ability, because this is where Uriel's third ability comes into play. Introducing Demonium. Casting this ability will shoot out a homing projectile for each demon alive. The projectile will bounce between targets and explode each time it hits an enemy, dealing damage and increasing the enemy's vulnerability. Enemies will take more damage when afflicted with vulnerability, and the higher our ability strength, the higher this damage vulnerability will become. Meanwhile, our ability duration will affect the duration of the vulnerability effect, along with the duration of the projectile's lifespan. Furthermore, while our first ability is active, any enemies hit by our third ability will emit a ring of fire that inflicts heat damage and status effect per second to nearby enemies. However, the best part about this ability is that hitting enemies with it will charge up our gauge. This means that if we spam it at a group of enemies, we're able to quickly fill it up, allowing us to cast our fourth ability more often. But what is his fourth ability, and why is it so overpowered that it requires a full gauge just to cast it? And well, I'm glad you asked, because I'd sum it up to be something like this. Brimstone is Uriel's fourth ability, and casting it will expand a domain of hellfire that deals heat damage and status to enemies inside. Furthermore, each consecutive damage instance will increase its damage by 100%, up to a 10 times damage multiplier cap, which basically means that the longer enemies are inside our domain, the more damage they will receive. This is an incredibly powerful ability, and casting it requires a full gauge to do so. But now that we know how his abilities work, let's go over how to actually play Uriel. At the start of the mission, we will want to cast our second ability to gain overshields along with our first ability for mobility. We can also recast our first ability whenever its duration gets too low. Then, when we see a group of enemies, we'll want to cast our third ability to damage them and increase their vulnerability. Remember to also pick up the rune orbs whenever you see them. We'll also cast our second ability whenever we need to heal ourselves or our demons. Lastly, we can cast our fourth ability to nuke enemies when our gauge is full. And with that out of the way, let's go over how to finally build Uriel. Starting off with the all-rounded build. We're going to use corrosive projection in order to reduce enemy armor. Next, we'll slot in equilibrium in order to help with our energy sustainability. This is because we get a bunch of health orbs from our bird. And if you recall, the amount of orbs we get scales with strength. Therefore, we're going to slot Blind Rage and Umbral Intensify in order to increase our ability strength and damage. But we have another unique mod that can increase our ability damage. And that would be Archon Vitality, as all our ability damage comes in the form of heat. However, if you do not have Archon Vitality, feel free to swap it for Natural Talent for extra casting speed or Augur Reach for more ability range. And speaking of range, we're going to use both Overextended and Stretch to increase our ability range. And in order to make our abilities last for a longer period of time, we're going to use Primed Continuity for its extra ability duration. Lastly, we're going to use Flow for the increased energy pool. This is the general build that I would recommend to most players. However, if you prefer a more caster-focused build, then I'd replace Umbral Intensify for Streamline, and to use Primed Flow instead. This would allow us to spam our third ability, and in turn cast our fourth ability more often. Arcanes are entirely optional, but these are the ones that I would recommend. And if you do not have Arcane Concentration, Molt Efficiency will work just as fine, with just slightly less duration. And finally, for Archon Shards, these are the perks that I would recommend. But feel free to use whatever combination that suits your playstyle best, as these are entirely optional. Uriel has honestly been so fun to play with, and I hope you enjoyed watching the video as much as I did making it. But if you prefer using weapons to kill enemies, then be sure to check out my Beirut guide, where I show you how to wipe out entire rooms with a single melee attack. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. ご視聴いただきありがとうございました。さようなら。